Okay, we'll start with the last topic, that is the properties of skeletal muscle contraction. Okay, so these will be the learning outcomes where we'll talk about the describing the nature of muscle twitch. Twitch is nothing but a contraction. Okay, so we'll see the nature of the muscle twitch. We'll describe how the force of skeletal muscle contraction is graded, means how we can increase the force of skeletal muscle contraction. And we'll list the types of skeletal muscle contractions, giving examples for each. And we'll distinguish between the type of skeletal muscle fibers like fast and slow twitch muscle fibers. And we'll explain certain relationship between length and tension in the skeletal muscle based on the law, which is called as the Frank-Starling's law. So these will be the learning outcomes which will be achieved by the end of this lecture or this session. So coming to the three-component model of skeletal muscle, you must know to understand the facts which are associated with the skeletal muscle contraction. A three-component model of skeletal muscle is proposed. And according to this model, you can see it consists of the three components, which are the contractile components. In small letters, abbreviations, it is written as CC, which is the contractile component. And this contractile component represents the thick and the thin filaments in the myofibril. Then we have the next component of the skeletal muscle, that is called as the series elastic component, or SEC. Now these series elastic component refers to the elastic tissue of the muscle, which is present in the muscle in series with the contractile component. Like you must have heard about the series and the parallel circuits. Similar to that, here we have the components which are in series with the contractile component, which is called as the series elastic component. And usually it consists of the tendon of the skeletal muscle. So that forms the series elastic component. Then coming to the third component, which is called as the parallel elastic component. Now the parallel elastic component is represented by the elastic tissue of the muscle, such as the connective tissue, the sarcolemma, and all the other components like endomysium, epimysium, perimysium. So all these forms the parallel elastic elements. So they say that the 60% of the muscle proteins form the contractile component, and the rest 40% of the muscle proteins form the series and the parallel elastic components. So this is about the series parallel elastic components and the contractile component of the skeletal muscle. Now coming to the contraction of the single muscle fiber. Now we can study the contraction of the skeletal muscle fiber by isolating the muscle from the body and with the intact nerve. Okay, so it is a nerve muscle preparation, definitely not from the humans. We usually experimentally we can investigate the muscle fiber contraction. We usually take the frog's nerve muscle preparation. We have a muscle, we have a nerve supply, nerve which is attached to the muscle, or nerve which is innervating the muscle. So that is been taken out, and then we see whether the muscle fiber, how there is contraction. So experimentally we can investigate the muscle fiber contraction. And in our body, how the skeletal muscle contracts is because of the impulses through a motor nerve axon, which causes contraction of a motor unit. So what is a motor unit? Can anyone tell me?
It's a collection of a motor neuron with its axon.
Okay, motor neuron with its axon. Then?
To the presynaptic junction. To the postsynaptic junction.
Branches.
Axonal branches. Okay, and?
The muscle it innervates.
Yes, the muscle fibers it innervates. Okay, not the muscle fibers. That forms the motor unit. So a nerve fiber with its axon, its axonal branches, and the muscle fibers it innervates forms a motor unit. And the impulses through a motor nerve axon causes contraction of a motor unit. So in our body, there is impulses which are sent to the motor nerve, that is the somatic nerve, and that will cause the contraction of the muscle fibers which are present in the motor unit. Now we'll see how the single muscle fiber contraction is seen in the experimentally. And the experimentally, when we take a nerve muscle preparation and we apply a stimulus, a contraction is observed in the single muscle fiber, and that is called as the single muscle fiber twitch. So we apply a stimulus to the nerve muscle preparation and we observe a muscle contraction. That is called as single muscle fiber twitch. Now, we can plot the graph when we record this experimentally, and we have on the x-axis and the y-axis. X-axis denotes the time and the y-axis denotes the tension. Now, what is the muscle tension? It is the force within the muscle that pulls the two ends of the muscle towards each other. So that is called as the muscle tension. So we can plot the graph and see whether there is any change in the muscle tension during contraction or during relaxation when you apply a stimulus. That is called as the single muscle fiber twitch. Now the graph which is obtained here, which we can see here, this graph, when you apply a stimulus, stimulus is applied, action potential is recorded, and then you get a response. That response is the mechanical response. Okay, it is not an electrical response. Electrical response has led to a mechanical response. So when a muscle is stimulated, it exhibits a twitch-like contraction, and that is called as the single muscle fiber twitch, or we call it as the simple muscle twitch. Okay, and the curve, what is obtained here, we call it as the simple muscle curve. Okay, the graph which is obtained here is called as the simple muscle curve, where the x-axis you can see is the time in milliseconds, and we have the y-axis which is the tension generated in the muscle, and it is expressed in milligrams. It is expressed in milligrams. Now, if you observe here in the graph, we can see different periods or the time duration. Okay, so the three periods which you can see here, the first one here is called as the latent period. And the second period, what you can see here, is called as the contraction period. It is called as the contraction period. And the last period, what you see here, is called as the relaxation period. So whenever we apply a stimulus to the skeletal muscle, there will be a latent period followed by contraction period, and there is a relaxation period. This curve is called as the simple muscle curve. Now, what you observe here is at the 0 milliseconds. Okay, that is the point where the stimulus was applied. And if you observe, immediately there is no increase in the tension. Okay, immediately there is no increase in the tension. So there is a gap here until the tension starts to increase. So that gap is called as the latent period. We call it as the latent period. So at 0, we have applied the stimulus, and there is a brief gap between the point of stimulus and the point where the tension starts to increase. This period is called as the latent period. Now what happens is, when you apply a stimulus, immediately there won't be cross-bridge cycling, right? If you apply a stimulus, it takes time for the muscle action potential to be generated. Then the muscle action potential has to be propagated. That has to cause a conformational change in the dihydropyridine receptor, and the ryanodine receptor has to release calcium. Calcium has to go and bind to troponin C, and then the cross-bridge cycling is initiated. So all these events occur during the latent period. All these events occur during the latent period. So immediately you don't see an increase in the tension or the force. Okay, tension or the force is generated when there is the sliding of the filaments, when there is shortening of the sarcomere. That occurs, that is the second step of the cross-bridge cycling. So all the initial events fall under the latent period. That is the development of muscle action potential up till the power stroke. So all these events are occurring during the latent period. Now, following the latent period, you observe that the tension starts to increase. The muscle tension starts to increase. And that period is called as the contraction period. That is from the beginning to increase in the tension to the maximum increase in the tension. That is called as the contraction period. And during the contraction period, the muscle shortens, or the sarcomere shortens, or there is sliding of the filaments. So that is the contraction period. And we have seen how the what are the steps involved in cross bridge cycling. So I'll not go into detail again. So please refer to the previous session where we talked about the cross bridge cycling. So that events occur during the contraction period. Now, once the tension is reached maximum, then there is a decrease in the tension. You can see here, there is a decrease in the tension. And that period is called as the relaxation period. Okay. Now, how does the skeletal muscle relax?
Many of activities.
Yes.
By the detachment of the calcium, and then the calcium goes back to the sarcoplasmic reticulum.
Yes, it is not due to the detachment. It is due to the calcium being pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. How does, what pumps it back?
ATPase.
Calcium ATPase. Okay, calcium ATPase pumps the calcium from the sarcoplasm into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So that events occur during the relaxation period. So when you apply a stimulus to the skeletal muscle, there is a time period during which the excitation contraction coupling is happening, and that period is called as a latent period, following which there is cross bridge cycling, that is called as the contraction period. And then the calcium is pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That period is called as the relaxation period. And the curve, what is obtained, is called as the simple muscle curve. There is no electrical change here. Electrical change is causing the mechanical change, means the sarcomere is going to be shortened, and there is increase in the tension followed by decrease in tension. So all these changes are mechanical changes. So that is called as the simple muscle curve. And the twitch-like contraction is called as the simple muscle twitch. When I say twitch-like contraction, means there is a sudden increase in the tension. Okay, when you apply a stimulus, increase in tension followed by a decrease in tension. That is simple muscle twitch. And the curve, what is obtained, is called as the simple muscle curve. And you must give a threshold stimulus. Okay, you must apply a threshold stimulus. Otherwise, you won't get a action potential. And if there is no action potential, there won't be a mechanical response. So that is about the simple muscle curve, which is obtained and which has an x-axis and a y-axis. Any questions on that? Okay, so we can alter the force of contraction, means we can increase or change the tension developed in the muscle. And what are the factors which can change the tension or the force of contraction in the skeletal muscle? And these factors include the strength of the stimulus, the number of stimulus given to the skeletal muscle, which is the frequency of the stimulus. Also the length of the muscle fiber at the onset of contraction, means at the beginning of contraction, what is the length of the muscle fiber? That also can decide how much tension is developed in the skeletal muscle during contraction. So these are few factors which we are going to discuss in the subsequent slides. There are, in addition to these, factors like changes in temperature, changes in the load which is acting on the muscle, that also can affect the force of contraction. The ones which are written in bold here, you have to explore more about the effect of temperature and effect of load on the muscle, how it can affect the force of contraction. The part of the load on the muscle, how it affects the force of contraction, will be dealt in the lab session. And I want you to find out about the effect of temperature, how it affects the force of contraction. We'll see about the strength of the stimulus, number of stimulus, and the length of the muscle fiber at the onset of contraction, one by one. Coming to the strength of the stimulus, that is, what is the effect of increasing the strength of the stimulus on muscle contraction? Now, a few things to remember here is a single muscle fiber obeys all or none law. Okay, single muscle fiber obeys all or none law, but the whole muscle does not obey all or none law. Okay, a single muscle fiber obeys all or none law, and the entire muscle does not obey all or none law. So we'll see about that if you apply a subthreshold stimulus, the muscle will not contract. Why? Why do you think when I apply a subthreshold stimulus, muscles do not contract?
Because
No
it,
action.
yeah,
Yes. Yes. Yes, Irfan.
because like it's subthreshold is like lower than threshold, so like it doesn't meet the point to to do muscle contraction.
Why?
Because
Oh, none
stimuli.
law.
Yes, all or none law. So if I apply a threshold stimulus, what is not generated?
End plate potential is not generated.
Action potential in the muscle is not generated. If there is no action potential in the muscle, there is no muscle excitation, no contraction. Okay, it's always excitation is coupled to contraction. If there is no excitation, there is no contraction. Okay, so when I apply a threshold stimulus, there is no muscle excitation, so the muscles do not contract. Now, when I apply a threshold stimulus, there will be contraction, and this will excite few motor units. Okay, it will excite few motor units and gives us a weaker contraction. This is what, when I'm talking about the muscle, I'm not talking about the muscle fiber. I'm talking entire muscle. I'm applying a threshold stimulus and it will excite few motor units, and this will give a weaker contraction. Now, with increasing the strength of the stimulus more, means more than threshold. What do we call that? More than threshold stimulus?
Supra-threshold.
Yes, supra-threshold stimulus. So I increase the strength of the stimulus, I increase more than the threshold, more motor units are activated, or we call it as the recruitment of motor units. Okay, it is called as recruitment of motor units. That is, more muscle fibers are excited. If more muscle fibers are excited, more conformational change of the dihydropyridine receptors, more calcium will be released, more calcium will bind to more troponin C, more cross bridges will form, and this will increase the magnitude of the contraction. Okay, so that is called as the recruitment of motor units. So if you take an example, if you want to lift a weight of 5 kg or 10 kg, you are using the same hand, your same muscles are contracting, and you can lift both the weights, 5 kg or 10 kg. That is because of the recruitment of motor units. For 5 kg weight to lift, only few motor units are going to be activated, and for 10 kg weight, if you want to lift, more motor units are going to be recruited, and this will lead to a stronger contraction, and this is called as the recruitment of motor units. It is said that whenever the motor units are going to be activated, the first motor units which are activated are the small motor units. Okay, small motor units followed by medium sized and large sized. When I say small motor units, means the motor units with less number of branches, less number of muscle fibers they innervate. They are called as the small motor units. And with the increasing in the strength of the stimulus, when there is recruitment of motor units, the larger sized motor units are going to be activated in addition to the smaller sized motor units. Okay, so this is what you need to remember. The muscle fiber obeys all or none law. Muscle does not obey all or none law. Subthreshold stimulus, no contraction, no muscle excitation. Threshold stimulus, few motor units are activated, so you can get a weaker contraction, and the small motor units are activated first. And with increasing the strength of the stimulus, there is recruitment of motor units, means small motor units plus the large motor units are going to be activated, and this will increase the magnitude of the contraction. Magnitude means height of contraction, or the force of contraction is increased. The tension developed in the muscle is going to be increased. Okay, so they are all the same terminologies which are used. Magnitude of contraction, force of contraction, tension developed in the muscle, they all mean the same. Okay, so this is what happens if you increase the strength of the stimulus, and how does it affect the muscle contraction. Then coming to the next factor which can affect the force of contraction is the number of stimulus, or the frequency of the stimulus. How does it affect the force of contraction? Now, the frequency of the stimulus can be two successive stimulus, or it can be multiple stimulus. Okay, it can be two successive. Two successive means one after the other. Okay, so what is the effect of two successive stimulus, and what is the effect of multiple stimulus on the force of contraction? We'll see in the next slides here. This is the two successive stimulus. So you can see here S1, S2 and S3. These are the stimulus. Okay, this is the first stimulus, this is the second, followed by the third stimulus. Okay, so you can see here the first stimulus is applied at 0, and then you get a simple muscle curve and allow the muscle to completely relax and come back to the resting state, and then we apply the second stimulus and we get again another response, that is the simple muscle curve, and then allow the muscle to relax completely, apply the third stimulus, and you can see the muscle curve here. Now what has happened to the tension developed? Has it changed?
No.
No. So there is identical twitches which are occurring when you apply successive stimulus. Now when have you applied the successive stimulus? That during the previous contraction, relaxation has completely occurred. After that, you have applied the successive stimulus. And what have you observed? There is no change in the muscle tension. Okay, there is no change in the muscle tension. Now, in the next graph, you can see here, we have applied the stimulus, the first stimulus. And what do you observe? There is muscle contraction followed by relaxation. And once the muscle is completely relaxed, you're going to apply the second stimulus. Now, what do you observe? That the muscle is undergoing contraction, where the muscle tension is increased and it is beginning to relax. When it begins to relax, you are going to apply the successive stimulus. You're going to apply the third stimulus. What has happened to the tension?
Increases.
There is the third contraction shows a greater tension development. Now, why do you think there is an increase in the tension or increase in the force?
It's greater than the initial stimulus, so super threshold.
No, you have not changed the strength of the stimulus. The strength of the stimulus of S1, S2, S3 are same.
Summation.
What do you mean by summation?
Refractory.
Like there was the property of the created potential, since they don't have a refractory period. Before the first potential ends, if you apply another stimulus, both of them add up.
Hmm?
And
So,
leads to
where do you think there is summation here? You have applied the stimulus, you have got the action potential, and you have seen the contraction. During the relaxation, you have given another stimulus. So what happens during the relaxation?
Stronger
it-
tension resulted.
What normally happens to cause relaxation?
The calcium ATPase pumps the calcium back to SR.
Yes. So what happens to the calcium concentration in the sarcoplasm?
It increases.
Sarcoplasm decreases or increases?
But during relaxation, ma'am, it should increase, right?
During relaxation, you said the calcium is pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, right? From the sarcoplasm.
Or sarcoplasm, then it should decrease.
Decrease. Okay, there should be decrease in the sarcoplasmic calcium concentration. Now, what happens here is not all calcium is being pumped back. Okay, not all calcium is being pumped back because you have applied another stimulus again. So before all the calcium could go back, you have applied another stimulus. More calcium is released from the previous contraction. Not all calcium is gone back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So what happens to the total amount of calcium in the sarcoplasm?
Greater than normal.
Yes, it will be greater than normal. So if it is greater than normal, what will happen to the number of cross bridges?
More.
increases.
Increases. If more number of cross bridges means the
More
muscle tension is going to be increased. Okay. So when you apply another stimulus during the relaxation period, normally calcium is pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum and it decreases the sarcoplasmic calcium concentration. But you have applied the stimulus, you have not allowed all calcium to be pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So calcium remains in the sarcoplasm and you have applied the stimulus again, more calcium is released. And so altogether there is increase in the sarcoplasmic calcium concentration. And this will increase the number of cross bridges and this will increase the muscle tension. Okay, so that is why when you apply the successive stimulus, once it is completely relaxed, you don't observe any increase in the force of contraction. But if you give it during the relaxation period, you observe an increase in the force of contraction. The muscle tension developed is going to be increased. Now the third graph, if you see here, what has happened here? Where is the third stimulus applied?
Together with the second stimulus.
Yes. So which period of the simple muscle curve are we applying the third stimulus?
Latent period.
Is it the latent or is it the contraction period?
Contraction period.
Okay, the contraction period. Okay, when you apply the stimulus during the contraction period, two successive stimulus, you give one after the other. One stimulus you give, when it is going to contract, immediately you give another stimulus. Two successive stimulus given during the contraction period. What do you observe in the muscle tension? Compare it with the one
Greater.
stimulus. Yes, it will
Will be
be greater. Why do you think it is greater? When you apply two stimulus, what is going to happen?
More calcium is being released.
Yes, you'll have two action potentials being generated. More calcium will be released. One calcium, some amount of calcium is released for S2 stimulus. Some more calcium is released for the S3 stimulus. If more calcium is released, where is it released? Into
sarcoplasm.
Sarcoplasm. If more calcium is present in the sarcoplasm, what does it do?
It
Binds to
Troponin C.
Binds to troponin C, exposes the active sites, more cross bridge formation, and you will have an increase in the muscle tension. This is called as summation. We call it as summation. Okay. So you don't see two graphs here. You see one graph and the graph for S2 and S3 are added or summated to form a larger graph. Okay, so that is called as summation. And this is what is observed when you apply successive stimulus. Okay. So if you apply successive stimulus, you may observe an increase in force of contraction. You may not observe an increase in force of contraction. And this depends on when the successive stimulus is applied. Is it applied after the muscle is completely relaxed? Is it applied during the relaxation? Is it applied during the contraction period? Is it applied during the latent period? What is going to happen to the force of contraction? So we have seen in the graphs here. Okay, this is when there is complete relaxation, you apply the successive stimulus. This is during the relaxation period, and this is during the contraction period. You observe there is change in the force of contraction. Any questions?
So, doctor, correct
Yes.
me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
So the first graph is when after the completely relaxes, so during the
Yes.
latent. So the second one is during the relaxation,
Yes.
but not all of the but not complete relaxation, right?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And okay, thank you, doctor.
Yes. Any other questions? Okay, then we have the multiple stimulus. Okay, multiple stimulus. Now, instead of two successive stimulus, these are all multiple stimulus. So this is one single stimulus where you see a twitch-like contraction, and then you give multiple stimulus. What do you observe? When do you give this multiple stimulus?
Relaxation period.
Yes, during the relaxation period. The subsequent contraction, what do you observe in the magnitude of the tension or the contraction?
Contraction.
Increased, right? The force of contraction is going to be increased. It looks like a step increase in the force of contraction, looks like a staircase. Okay, it looks like a staircase. So we call it as the staircase phenomenon. We call it as unfused tetanus. We also call it as treppe. And this occurs when there is a subsequent increase in the force of contraction when the subsequent stimuli falls during the relaxation period. During the relaxation period, if you apply another stimulus, the force of contraction is going to be increased, and it is increasing in a stepwise fashion. And that is called as the staircase phenomenon, or we call it as treppe, or we call it as the unfused tetanus. We call it as the unfused tetanus. Okay, so we give multiple stimulus here, and if you observe in the extreme right, where so many stimuli are given here, there are so many stimuli given here, where multiple stimulus is given, the frequency is increased to such an extent that the next stimulus falls during the contraction period, during the contraction period. And what do you observe here? Is there relaxation?
Doctor.
Yes? No, there is no relaxation. There is only contraction. Okay, there is only contraction. And all the contractions for all the stimuli are fused. Okay, they are fused. And the contraction is quite smooth, and it is a sustained contraction, and that is called as fused tetanus. We call it as the fused tetanus. So when the frequency of multiple stimulus is such that the next stimulus falls during the contraction phase of the previous stimulus, the muscle will remain in a state of smooth, sustained contraction, and that is called as fused tetanus, or we call it as the tetanic type of skeletal muscle contraction. Tetanic type of skeletal muscle contraction. Don't confuse it with the disease tetanus. Okay, that is a different, altogether different. It is caused by a microorganism. Okay, this type of contraction is a fused, smooth, forceful contraction. Okay, sustained contraction. And when do you observe it? When you apply multiple stimulus. And where the multiple stimulus should fall? It should fall during the contraction period, and that is called as the fused tetanus. So we'll see about the treppe, staircase phenomenon, and tetanus in a little detail. As I said, treppe is called as the staircase phenomenon, where you give the series of stimulus and you observe there is a increase in the tension developed during each twitch, And this is due to the increased availability of calcium for binding to troponin C. More calcium means more binding to troponin C, more exposure of active site, more cross bridge formation, and this will increase the force of contraction. Now, what happens during multiple stimulation? If you apply the stimulus so rapidly that you don't have the opportunity to relax at all between the stimulus, maximal sustained contraction known as fused tetanus or tetanic type of contraction is seen. Now, what is the ionic basis of tetanus is when the muscle is stimulated in a rapid succession, there occurs accumulation of calcium ions in the sarcoplasm. Okay, so when you apply multiple stimulus for every action potential, calcium will be released into the sarcoplasm, and so the amount of calcium in the sarcoplasm will be increased, and so there will be continuous recycling of the myosin heads. So cross bridge cycling will be recycling. Okay, and this will lead to a sustained type of muscle contraction, which is called as tetanus. This is the ionic basis of tetanus. There is accumulation of calcium in the sarcoplasm. And this accumulation is because you are giving multiple stimulus. You are not allowing the muscle to relax. So for every stimulus you apply, calcium will be released. So the calcium concentration in the sarcoplasm is going to be increased. More cross bridges will be formed, and there will be increase in the force of contraction. Am I clear?
Yes, doctor.
Anybody has any questions? Okay, so how is tetanus possible? Okay, so how is tetanus possible is because the muscle action potential is much shorter in duration than the contraction. So if you see, this period is the latent period, and then you have the contraction period followed by the relaxation period. This you already know. And the muscle action potential is quite short. Okay, and it falls during the latent period. The action potential is during the latent period itself. Okay, so you know the refractory period of the action potential, right? Which phase of the action potential you observe absolute and the relative refractory period?
Absolute is during the repolarization, and the refractory period is actually during the hyperpolarization.
Yes, so absolute refractory period is from the threshold to depolarization to the repolarization until it comes back to the resting state, and then you have the relative refractory period. And this form falls in the latent period. Okay, this falls under the latent period. So when you apply the stimulus during the contraction period, the membrane is already out of the refractory period. It is already out of the refractory period. So if you apply another stimulus, the membrane is now again back to the resting state. It is out of the refractory period. A new action potential will be generated, and it can be increasing the force of contraction and lead to tetanic type of contraction. Okay, so the muscle action potential is shorter in duration and falls during the latent period, and the refractory period of the muscle finishes before the maximum tension is reached. This leads to the tetanus. This makes the tetanus possible in skeletal muscle because the action potential is shorter in duration than the contraction. Now, what do you think will happen to the muscle contraction if I apply the stimulus during the latent period? I apply multiple stimulus during the latent period. What do you think will happen?
A greater
Will there be
contraction.
tetanus?
Yeah.
Think in terms of refractory period.
No.
No. Okay, so no, because if you see the latent period and compare it with the muscle action potential, this is where you will have the muscle action potential, and if you correlate the mechanical response, it is the latent period during that time. and it is in the refractory period. So if I apply another stimulus, the membrane is not going to generate another action potential. If there is no new action potential generated, no contraction. Okay, so during the latent period, if I apply a multiple stimulus, tetanus is not possible. So when should I apply multiple stimulus? I must make sure to get a tetanic type of contraction. I need to apply the successive stimulus, multiple stimulus during the contraction period, because that part of the membrane now is not in the refractory. It is not in the refractory period. If it is in the refractory period, it is not going to generate another action potential. There won't be any contraction. So I need to make sure that the membrane is not in the refractory period. The refractory period is observed during the latent period of the mechanical response. And if I apply during the latent period, I may not observe tetanic type of contraction. But if I apply during the contraction period, there will be tetanic type of contraction, because the membrane is not in the refractory period, because the action potential is shorter in duration than the contraction. It's already over, the action potential, before the contraction begins. So it is not in the refractory period. So this leads to a sustained contraction if you apply multiple stimulus during the contraction period. Am I clear?
Ma'am,
Yes.
could you explain the refractory period of the muscle again?
Okay. See, if you observe, this is the electrical response and this is the mechanical response. Okay. So they occur one after the other. Okay. When I apply a stimulus, first thing is there will be an electrical response. And when the action potential is generated, the muscle is still under the latent period. Okay. And then it will start to increase the muscle tension. And that time what has happened to the muscle membrane? It is not in the refractory period. It has already come back to the resting state. The depolarization, repolarization is already over and the membrane has come back to the resting state. So if I apply this another stimulus, same strength to the same region, another action potential will be generated, and this can lead to again contraction. And if I give multiple stimulus, it can lead to sustained contraction, causing tetanic type of muscle contraction. Am I clear?
So, ma'am, during the contraction time,
Yes.
there won't be any electrical change, correct?
Which one?
Like during the contraction period, the electrical
Yes.
change is during the latent period.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
That is if you apply a single stimulus.
And in the case of multiple stimulus,
Multiple
there will
stimulus, yes, when you apply to the same area, it has already started the contraction. For the next stimulus, it will undergo latent period, contraction period, and the relaxation period.
So then, ma'am, in that case, for the graph below, the stimulation in
Yes.
time one, it will show like many what do you call it?
Action potentials, yes.
Yes, and at
Yes.
the same level, correct?
Yes, yes, at the same level.
All right.
Okay.
Doctor,
And for each stimulus, calcium will be released.
Right.
So the amount of calcium in the sarcoplasm is going to be increased.
Right.
And that will gradually increase the force of contraction, leading to a sustained contraction, which is called as tetanus. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes.
doctor.
Yes, Irfan.
Okay, just to summarize, basically tetanus can only occur in contraction time with subsequent
Yes, multiple stimulus. Yes.
All right.
Yes. Okay. And if you continuously apply stimulus, if you apply stimulus or lesser stimulus, you may observe a staircase phenomenon or unfused tetanus. And if you apply the stimulus where the multiple stimuli falls during the contraction period, you will get tetanus. And if you completely give so many stimulus, slowly the muscle is going to be relaxing. The muscle tension is going to be decreased. That is called as the fatigue. So repeated stimulation and contraction leads to reduction in the force generated in the skeletal muscle, which is called as the muscle fatigue. Okay, so that is called as the muscle fatigue. So muscle fatigue develops after prolonged exercise like a marathon or after you play for a long time. So you may observe that there is a decrease in the muscle tension, and that is called as the muscle fatigue. It is a temporary phenomenon. More about fatigue we'll discuss in the seminar. This is a seminar topic. I just want to tell you that if you apply continuous stimulus, multiple stimulus, it yes leads to tetanic type of contraction, but it's not going to be remain there. Okay, after some time the muscle tension is going to be decreased even though you are applying the stimulus. Multiple stimulus is applied during the contraction period. After some time the muscle tension is going to be decreased. That's because of the muscle fatigue. Muscle fatigue is a temporary phenomenon. It is a failure of the muscle to maintain the muscle tension as a result of previous contractile activity, and this is known as muscle fatigue. Various causes of muscle fatigues are known. We have the lack of ATP, accumulation of lactic acid, and also depletion of the glycogen stores. Okay, so these are few causes of muscle fatigue. There are many more which will be discussed in the seminar. We'll also have fatigue in the lab sessions. So I'm just giving you the overview. Lack of ATP, accumulation of lactic acids, and also the lack of glycogen or depletion of glycogen can also lead to muscle fatigue. We know we require ATP in cross-bridge cycling, that is attachment, detachment, and also for the relaxation we require ATP. There is no ATP, there is no cross-bridge cycling, so there is no increase in the tension. The lactic acid accumulation can also interfere with the enzymes which are involved in the cross-bridge cycling, which are involved in the pumping back of calcium into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and also in the enzymes involved in the energy producing pathways. You know the energy producing pathways? Biochemical pathways which
Yes,
can
yes,
generate
Yes,
ATP. Okay.
yes,
You
yes,
know about the oxidative phosphorylation and
Yeah.
glycolytic
yes.
pathways, right?
Yes.
So yes, so the enzymes involved in those pathways are inhibited if there is accumulation of lactic acid. So lactic acid accumulation is usually seen in short duration, high intensity exercises like weightlifting or short distance running, okay, where the muscles are using anaerobic glycolytic pathways to generate ATP, and in the pathway when it is being activated there will be accumulation of lactic acid, and this will inhibit the enzymes. Okay, and the glycogen stores are also going to be depleted. They usually seen in low intensity long duration exercises like marathon race. There will be depletion of the glycogen reserves, and this will lead to less glucose, less ATP, less energy, and lead to less muscle tension or muscle fatigue. Okay, so that is about the muscle fatigue, the causes of muscle fatigue. And the last factor which we'll see here is the initial length of the muscle fiber. Okay, what do you mean by initial length of the muscle? Is the length of the muscle prior to the muscle contraction. Okay, the length of the muscle before the muscle contraction, that is called as the initial length of the muscle fiber or initial length of the muscle. Okay, so what is the effect of the initial length of the muscle is, as the initial length increases, what happens to the muscle tension? It increases up till a limit, and after that, even though the initial length increases, there is a decrease in the muscle tension. Okay, so initial length increases, the muscle tension increases, yes, but up till a limit, beyond which, even though the initial length increases, the muscle tension is going to be decreased. So as the initial length of the muscle increases, the tension generated also increases, but after a certain limit, further increase in the length results in decreased tension. This graph is called as the length tension graph. It is called as the length tension graph, and the length is the initial length of the muscle, which is the length of the muscle prior to the muscle contraction, before the muscle contraction. And this is explained based on the law, which is called as the Frank-Starling's law, which states that the force of the contraction is directly proportional to the initial length of the muscle fiber, but within the physiological limit. Means up till the limit, when the initial length of the muscle fiber increases, the force of contraction also increases. There is a direct relationship up till the limit. Beyond the limit, there is no direct relationship. This is called as Frank-Starling's law, found out by Frank Starling, so called as the Frank-Starling law. This is applicable to skeletal muscle and also to the cardiac muscle. We'll only discuss about the skeletal muscle here. More about the Frank-Starling's law and its application will be dealt in the cardiovascular system. But the law remains the same. The force of contraction is directly proportional to the initial length of the muscle fibers within the physiological limit. So we must know what is this physiological limit, and that is called as shown in this graph, which is again the length tension relationship, where in the x-axis you have the length and on the y-axis you have the tension. So if you observe here, the ones which are written here, 2, 2.25, 1.65, these are all the lengths of the sarcomere. These are the length of the sarcomere. If you observe here, when the sarcomere length is between 2 to 2.25 microns, where the maximum tension is seen. So when the sarcomere length is between 2 to 2.25, the tension developed in the muscle is maximum. When the sarcomere length is decreased from 2 to 1.65 or 1.25, what happened to the muscle tension? It's going to be decreased. And when the sarcomere length increased from 2.25 beyond, also there is a decrease in the muscle tension. This is what is the length tension relationship graph shows. Okay, so why there is a increase or decrease in the tension when there is a change in the sarcomere length or change in the muscle length is because you must know the tension developed is proportional to the number of cross bridges that cycle. Okay, more the number of cross bridges means more the tension. Less the number of cross bridges means less the muscle tension. So that is what you need to remember. More number of cross bridges means more tension or more force developed in the skeletal muscle. Now what happens at the sarcomere length 2 to 2.25 microns, the tension is maximal because more or maximal possible cross bridges are formed when the sarcomere length is between 2 to 2.25 microns. Now what happens when the muscle is stretched? That is when it is changed from this length, okay, 120 to 160 and beyond. What happens? The muscle is stretched to longer length, and what happens to the number of cross bridges is also going to be reduced. So you can see here what happens when the muscle length is increased. What happens to the sarcomere length? Sarcomere length is also going to be increased. When the sarcomere length is increased, the sarcomere is stretched, so less number of cross bridges are being formed. That is, less actin-myosin interaction occurs. So that will decrease the number of possible cross bridges. Now the same is seen when the muscle length is decreased. Okay, muscle length is decreased from 100 to 80 or 60. What happens to the sarcomere length? Also decreases 2 to 1.65 to 1.25 microns. What happens to the sarcomere? It is going to be decreased. When the sarcomere is going to be decreased, what happens is the thin filaments collide with each other. Okay, thin filaments come one upon another. So this will also decrease the number of cross bridges. So what happens? The active sites which are exposed are going to be over the active sites exposed of the opposite side. So less number of cross bridges are formed. So thereby it decreases the muscle tension. So both situation, the number of cross bridges formed are going to be reduced, and therefore you have the decrease in the muscle tension. Okay, so that is about the length tension relationship. Coming to the types of skeletal muscle contraction, you must be knowing the two types of skeletal muscle contraction are isotonic and isometric type of contraction. Okay, so as the name suggests, isotonic means iso means same, tonic means tension. Okay, iso means same, tonic means tension. So it is a type of contraction in which the tension remains constant, but the muscle length changes. That is called as the isotonic type of contraction. Okay, so isotonic contraction, the tension remains same, but the length is going to be changed. Few examples of isotonic type of contraction are the contraction of the leg muscles during walking and running, or while you are lifting the weight, or contraction of the muscles during any movement like flexion, extension. So that is those contractions which are occurring in the skeletal muscles are called as isotonic type of contraction. Okay, the next type of contraction is isometric contraction. Iso means same, metric means length. In this type of contraction, the length of the muscle fiber remains the same. The tension is going to be increased. This type of contraction is called as isometric contraction. Few examples of isometric contraction include the contraction of the muscles which help in the maintenance of posture against gravity, or whenever you are trying to push a heavy object like a wall. Okay, there is contraction of the arm muscles and that contraction is called as the isometric type of contraction. Now, why we call them as the isometric or isotonic, and what changes we observe in the skeletal muscle is seen here. Okay, so this is the resting muscle. This is the isometric type of contraction. What has happened to the this what we see here is the series elastic element. Okay, this is the series elastic element and this is the contractile component. Okay, what has happened to the contractile component in isometric contraction?
Remains the same.
Contractile component, see, this is the resting state and this is during the
Increase,
contraction. Is it increase, decrease, remain same?
No, remains the same.
increase.
Look at the picture, look at the picture,
It
look at the
increases.
picture. Decreases or increases?
Decrease.
Increase.
This is the normal length in the resting state. Now what has happened to the contractile component?
The
Decrease.
length is decreased.
Contractile
Decrease.
component is decreased.
Increase.
Okay, this is decreased. What has happened to the series elastic element?
Increases. Becomes longer.
Yes, series elastic element is going to be increased. Okay, so series elastic element is going to be increased. There is shortening of the contractile component. At the same time, series elastic element is going to be stretched, which compensates for the shortening produced by the contractile component. So what happens to the entire length of the muscle fiber? Muscle,
Remain the same.
it remains the same. Okay, the entire muscle is going to be of the same size. It is not going to be reduced in size. So that type of contraction is called as isometric contraction. Contractile component is going to be decreased. That means the sarcomere is going to be shortened. Okay, but at the same time, series elastic elements are going to be stretched. And this will lead to a no change in the skeletal muscle size. And this type of contraction is called as the isometric contraction. The length of the skeletal muscle remains the same. Okay, the tension is going to be changed because the sarcomere is going to be shortened. The series elastic elements are going to be stretched. So the tension is going to be increased and the length is not going to be changed. It is said that the tension which is generated because of the contractile element or contractile component is called as the active tension. We call it as active tension. And the tension which is generated by the series elastic component is called as the passive tension. Okay, so active tension is generated by the contractile component and series elastic component is going to generate the passive tension. Okay, so both are going to be increased and therefore tension is going to be increased in isometric contraction, but the length of the muscle is going to be remaining the same. There is no change in the muscle length. So you compare it with the resting state and compare in this during the contraction, there is no change in the muscle length. That type of contraction is called as the isometric contraction. Now see the isotonic contraction. What happens to the contractile component?
Decreases.
Decreases. And what happens to the muscle length?
Decreases.
There is a decrease in the muscle length. And what happens to the weight? This is the weight.
Decrease.
The weight is lifted.
Lifted.
Okay, weight is lifted. The weight is lifted, and when the weight is lifted, there is some kind of movement in the muscle. The muscle length changes and the weight is lifted. And during that type of contraction, there is no change in the muscle tension. Muscle tension is not going to change. That type of contraction is called as isotonic contraction. Okay, so you must know few examples of isometric and few examples of isotonic contraction. I have given you few examples. Yeah, we can ask you many more examples as MCQs we can give you and say which is isotonic and which is not isotonic, or which is isometric or which is not isometric. Okay, so that way you must know few examples of isometric and isotonic contraction. Lastly, we'll talk about the type of muscle fibers quickly. We have two types of muscle fibers, type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. And all muscles in our body have both the types of muscle fibers, type 1 and type 2. And in any individual, the relative proportion of type 1 and type 2 fibers varies in different muscles. Okay, some muscles may have more type 1, some muscles may have more type 2. Okay, so it varies from one muscle to another muscle, and all muscles have both types of muscle fibers. And the proportion of the two types of fibers also varies from individual to individual. Okay, I may have more of type 1 fibers, some of you may have more of type 2, some of you may have type 1 fibers. Anybody who are very good at marathon running? Anybody in the class who are marathon runners?
Used to.
Used to, okay. Any sprinters?
Yeah.
Fast runners?
Sprint. Yeah.
Okay, so the fast runners, the marathon runners, they have different proportion of the two type of fibers. Okay, that is type 1 may be more, type 2 may be more. So we'll see about the different types or the properties of type 1 and type 2 fibers. The type 1 fibers are called as the red fibers. Now why they are called red fibers is because of the presence of large amount of myoglobin. Myoglobin gives it the red color. Myoglobin is the hemoglobin type which is present in the skeletal muscle, which can store oxygen. It can store oxygen in the skeletal muscle and gives the red color. This is more in the type 1 fibers. Myoglobin is less in the type 2B fibers, so it does not give it the red color to the muscle fiber, and therefore it is called as the white muscle fiber. Now the other factor which is differentiating between type 1 and type 2 is the myosin ATPase enzyme activity. Okay, myosin ATPase enzyme activity is slow in type 1 and it is faster in type 2B fibers. Okay, and the calcium pumping capacity is moderate in type 1 and type 2B it is higher. Now because the myosin isoenzyme activity is slower in type 1 fibers, the type 1 fiber is also called as slow fibers, and the type 2B fiber is called as fast fibers because the myosin isoenzyme activity is faster. Okay, now the diameter of the type 1 fiber is moderate, type 2B is larger, and the type 1 fiber is also called as the oxidative fibers. Now why is it called as oxidative fibers is because it relies on oxidative phosphorylation for ATP. For the generation of ATP, it relies on oxidative phosphorylation. Type 2B fibers are called as glycolytic fibers because it depends on glycolysis for ATP. So it is called as the glycolytic fibers. So we call them slow oxidative fibers or fast glycolytic fibers. Type 1 is called as slow oxidative fibers. It is called as the red muscle fiber. Type 2B is called as the white fiber. It is called as fast glycolytic fibers. Now, in addition to the oxidative capacity, it has a lot of mitochondria, lot of capillary density. The blood flow is more to the type 1 fibers, and it has large amount of myoglobin. It is fair enough because we require mitochondria for the oxidative phosphorylation enzymes are present there. We need oxygen, so we need to have more blood flow. We need more oxygen, so we have a storehouse for oxygen in the skeletal muscle, that is myoglobin. So all these helps in the oxidative capacity in the type 1 fibers. We don't have mitochondria, we don't have much of capillary density or myoglobin in the type 2B fibers, so they rely on glycolysis for ATP, and therefore they are called as the glycolytic fibers. And if you look at the number of fibers in the motor unit, okay, the type 1 fibers have high number of fibers in the motor unit and type 2 have low, okay. I think you need to correct this in your slides. I think I have written it the opposite way. If that is so, please correct it. High in type 1 and low in type 2B fibers, okay. So there are more number of fibers in the motor unit in type 1 and less in type 2B. So smaller motor units and larger motor units. The muscle fiber diameter, we have seen the force is low, metabolic profile is oxidative, glycolytic. The contraction velocity means the speed with which they contract is moderate and fast in the type 2B fibers. Fatigability is low in type 1 and type 2B it is high. Why do you think fatigability is low?
Because less number of energy.
Yes. What is the metabolic profile of type 1?
Oxidative.
Oxidative phosphorylation. So the amount of ATP generated is more or less? More when you compare it with the glycolytic pathway. So there is, it shows low fatigability. The nerve fibers are small and larger in type 2B fibers. Okay, this is just to memorize the differentiating factors or between the type 1 and type 2B fibers. Okay, so in marathon runners, which type of fibers should be there?
All
More.
of them.
One.
Type 1 or type 2B?
Both.
Yes?
Both muscle.
Which one? I can't hear you.
Both muscle fiber.
Type 1 or type 2B?
More of type 1.
More of type 1. And if you are a sprinter?
More of type 2B.
Type 2B. You need to have fast and but you will be fatigued faster. Okay. Marathon runners, the fatigability should be low because it's a long distance slow runner. So they must have type 1 fibers. And that's why not all of us are sprinters or not all of us are marathon runners. Okay, so that completes the type of muscle or the properties of muscle contraction. Any questions? Okay, if you don't have any questions, we'll again touch upon the properties of skeletal muscle contraction in the lab session. Okay, so we'll discuss it again there. And you have a seminar at 2. So do you want 15 minutes later to start, or we start at 2?
Doctor, I think I suggest we can start later. Is that okay? 15 minutes.
15?
Yeah. Is that
Okay.
okay? Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. So we'll start at 2:15. All are okay, right? Okay. Thank you.